Hello. All right, hello everyone. Glad that you're here. I'm just going to get started. I'm under the impression that there was a way that I could make this record itself, but I don't see an option to do that. Well, I have another device recording me over there, so hopefully that will, I'm going to move a little closer to it so that you can hopefully pick up the sound okay, what I'm saying. All right, so welcome everybody to this first class of herbalism from the ground up. Somebody's audio is making a lot of noise, so maybe check and make sure that your audio is mute unless you need to say something. I don't know where that's coming from. So I am going to be talking about a lot of different things over the course of this course, but the early stage of this, I want to talk a lot about the concept of knowing the plants. I feel like this is the most fundamental thing that you can do as an herbalist, the kind of the source of all your abilities as an herbalist is to know the plants and have a working relationship with the plants and plant communities. And like I said, if you were here for the orientation the other day, not all herbalists, not all traditions of herbalists really do it that way. There are definitely people out there who know how to use products made from herbal medicines, formulas and things like that might not make them themselves, or that might be in a culture in which making the medicines is an entirely separate thing. My tradition is a little bit different than that, and I want to talk a little bit about that background and what my tradition is, what my lineage is as an herbalist, because I feel like that will help everybody to understand what we're talking about as we go forward. So I grew up in eastern Kentucky, where herbal medicine is still really common, really widely used, and I learned a lot from the community there, and I also learned a lot from my family, which is really where I kind of consider the main stream of my lineage to have come from, is from my father and my grandfather, and through them my great-grandmother, who I didn't know, and through her side of the family a very long tradition, long lineage of people, a family called O'Mara, who were pretty noteworthy healers at various different times in the last few centuries. They were based out of Ireland. Originally they were based out of an area called Tumivara in County Tipperary, Ireland, which is in the southwestern part of Ireland. And to make a long story short, it was a sort of craft that was passed down through families. Healing was in those days, and people who were in families that were hereditary healers would often marry their kids off to the kids of other people who were in the same line of work, and they would send their kids to live with other families, and so they could learn from people who were doing things a little bit differently. And then starting in the 1600s, they also started sending them to universities, to Reims and Oxford in particular. And then at the end of the 1600s, something really kind of disastrous happened where England was very bent on carrying out genocide and replacement of the population in Ireland. They pretty much were very successful in destroying the tribal power structure that things had been mostly based on up to that point. And they enacted a bunch of laws that made people, basically made it illegal to speak Irish or illegal to do anything that was traditionally, culturally Irish, and illegal for any Irish people to teach their children anything other than a trade. So they couldn't have like a basic education. And in response to that, what the people did was they had these secret schools called hedge schools. Skol Scarcha is the name for it in Irish. Scarcha means like called together. So that's one of the names for them in Irish. But anyway, that's why I called this overall program the hedge school, is in memory of that tradition of people calling people together and sharing information with them. And because I believe that herbal medicine is kind of a common heritage of everybody that should be shared and that should be propagated. And then this particular course, this particular one-year course, I'm calling Herbalism from the Ground Up. And in keeping with that, I want to kind of start with the actual connection between the plants and the ground before I even start getting all the way into our connection with the plants. I want to talk a little bit about getting to know the plants and getting to know the ground, getting to know the plants and their connection with the earth, their connection with the ecosystems that they grow in and live in. So there's many levels to that. There's, for example, there's a biome or biogeographical realm, you might call it, type of level where there's whole large areas of the world that might be, for instance, tundra or coniferous forests or temperate, what we would call maybe mixed mesophytic forests, which are not rainforests but not arid either, kind of have some plants that need a lot of water and some that don't. We also have deserts, seasides, lots of different large general types of places that different herbal medicines come from. So, you know, there are certain things that you can only find in deserts. There are certain things you can only find at the seaside. There are certain things you can only find in the rainforest, and there are probably certain things that you can only find in whatever area you live in as well. So those are kind of the big regions, the big categories maybe even, because they're not necessarily contiguous regions. And then within that we would have smaller things that we might refer to as bioregions. And exactly what a bioregion is not super well defined, or at least not super consistently defined. Different people mean different things when they say it. But you would have an area like, for example, the Appalachian Mountains or the Pacific Northwest that might have certain features that might not be as large as an entire biome, might be a lot more specific than that, but might have some particular features in common throughout that area, and also some plant communities in common throughout that area. Maybe some plant communities that only occur in that area, maybe some that are more common there, and so forth. And certainly some that don't grow in that area, whatever the area is. So that's more the bioregion level. And as an individual, as an herbalist, a lot of the time it's important for you to learn about sort of microhabitats, microclimates, and what we call stands. A stand is like a little community of plants, almost like what a village would be for humans. It's just like you might find a particular area where there's a bunch of nettles, and you can go back to that stand of nettles next year, and they'll be there again as long as nothing catastrophic has happened to them. And so I think that it's important for herbalists to cultivate a relationship with stands of plants. And in my lineage of herbalism and in my way of doing things, I use a process that's come to be referred to as vertical integration in the manufacturing world, but it's very much just the traditional thing in a lot of crafts like herbalism, which is the process of doing all the steps of it yourself. So you're not only working with the patients, you're also making the medicines, you're also going out and finding the medicines, maybe even cultivating the medicines or stewarding the plant communities. So there might be plant communities, stands of plants that you don't necessarily have ownership of or any sort of an exclusive legal right as far as humans are concerned to interact with this stand of plants, but you might have an ongoing relationship with the stand of plants where you go back there every year and you harvest them in a way that's productive rather than destructive to them. And that is a very possible thing to do, and it's a very necessary thing for herbalists to do. This is not meant to be an extractive process the way that coal mining is, or the way that timber harvesting often is, but needn't be either. It should be something that is beneficial for you as well as the plant community that you're harvesting from. You should be protecting your stands of plants and making sure anything that might be encroaching on them doesn't get a chance to, and so forth. And we'll get more into a lot of specifics about that as we go along, especially as we talk about particular plants and what the needs of those particular plants are. But for the moment, I just want to introduce that idea that we're not just there to gather or harvest plants, we're there to steward the plant communities and work with the plants. And this is a process that predates concepts like property and money and things like that. This is an older human tradition than those are. Gathering plants is something that we've done since forever. Like, it's probably really our oldest, at least as old as any other human tradition. So in learning this craft, you're learning to participate in this very primal human tradition that goes all the way back, and that your ancestors used to do even if your parents and grandparents didn't, and that you can pass on to younger people yourself if you choose to. So it's a really important part of our heritage as human beings, not just to look at plants as a commodity, but to look at plants as something that can be sustainably worked with. And so that's something that I really hope everybody will internalize in the process of this course, and will learn about more as we go along. In my own practice of wildcrafting, I have certain stands of plants that I've been harvesting from since I was old enough to walk, like since I was 3 or so years old, maybe even a little bit younger. I have a hard time remembering anything further back than that, but I definitely have pictures of myself with a little sandbox shovel and a wooden stake harvesting ginseng from the same sandy patch of soil that I harvest ginseng from. Well, the most recent time I was there was in 2018, but it's still a stand that I go back to periodically, and will continue to do so for as long as I'm physically capable of doing so. And before I was harvesting from that particular stand of ginseng, a man named Shorty Ross was harvesting from it, and he showed my father where it was and told him that he was too old to harvest from it anymore, and so that my dad could kind of take over working with that stand of ginseng. And that was in the late 1970s. And so it's still, the stand is actually larger than it was the first time I counted the plants in it, which was not until the 1990s. But it's a little bit bigger. It's, you know, basically takes up the whole part of that hillside that is a good place for ginseng to grow. So that's kind of what I want to talk a little bit more about tonight, is where plants grow. And as you know, plants grow just about everywhere that there's ground. There are a few places that are too dry or something like that. But particular plants, as you've probably noticed, grow in particular types of places. So you'll find dandelions in your yard. You probably won't ever find ginseng just accidentally growing in your yard. It could if you had the right kind of yard, but otherwise it's just really not going to. It only grows in a very specific area. Some plants, quite a lot of plants, are what we might call rooterals, or just kind of weeds, and they like to grow in disturbed ground. And because they like to grow in disturbed ground, they are very common around human habitations. They grow along paths, they'll grow in people's flower beds and gardens and farm fields and pastures. They'll grow, you know, along roadsides, although that's not really a good place to harvest them from because of pollution. But they'll grow in a lot of places where humans frequent. So you're likely to come in contact with these plants. And because they thrive on disturbances that humans create, they're sort of like our companions ecologically, in that they follow us around and end up where we end up. Sometimes people bring these plants, and sometimes they just, sometimes people intentionally bring these plants, and sometimes they just sort of show up on their own in soil or in the treads of someone's boot or something like that. And dandelions are probably a pretty good example of that. As far as we know, dandelions originated somewhere in Eurasia and were spread both along the Silk Road into East Asia, and then along with imperialism into North America. People brought them over and planted them as a crop. There were probably also seeds of them in with other crops that people brought over, in with grain and things like that, because grain always ends up with some other seeds in it that aren't what you meant for it to have. And dandelion being wind distributed, I don't know if you've ever really looked at a dandelion, but the seeds are actually carried on the wind, the little blow balls. That's the seed head, and each of those little bits of fluff has a seed attached to it. So it gets around, and it has gotten around, and now you'll find it in most places that aren't either too dry or too cold for too much of the year. So you don't really see it in the Arctic. You don't really see it much in desert type areas. Occasionally you do, but it's just not so common. Here where I live, in Lexington, Kentucky, where we get quite a lot of rain, it's a very common plant, and it's early in the spring it blooms very prolifically, and then throughout the rest of the year it blooms some, but not as much. So there are a lot of plants that we'll be learning about that are weeds type species that will grow in a pretty wide section of the world, and will grow prolifically on their own. Not all of these are really invasive species. So sometimes when people say weeds, they just mean introduced plants that kind of grow in disturbed ground and so forth. Sometimes people are talking more specifically about invasive species that tend to grow prolifically enough that they cause damage to the ecosystem, or are perceived as causing damage to the ecosystem. And we'll learn about some of those too. That would include things like garlic mustard, for instance, which tends to spread throughout forest floors in this bioregion, in disturbed areas especially, and in younger forests especially, but not exclusively. It'll grow in the shade, and so it does in places where a lot of other things tend not to grow. So in the next week, a good thing to do, not just in the next week, but for the rest of your life, but especially this next coming week, a good thing to do is to look around you and see what sorts of small habitats are in the areas that you go through on a daily basis, around your home or around your workplace or around wherever it is that you go. You'll probably notice that there are different types of places that have different types of plants in them. So some broad categories that you might see would be like meadows or just fields that aren't being closely cropped and maintained in any way, places where the grass is allowed to grow and it's not getting mowed a lot. You'll see certain types of plants there. If there's woods, you'll see, of course, trees, but you'll also see other plants growing under the trees that grow better under trees than they do out in the meadows. And if you look at the edge between the fields and the forest, that's usually where you'll see a pretty large number of different species. I did a video last year, might have even been the year before last by now. I did a video some time ago where I went to an unmowed yard in a park, just an area of unmowed lawn in a city park, and laid down a hula hoop and counted all the plants that were inside the hula hoop. And there were numerous different medicinal species just in that one little area about 4 feet or so across. So, there are often a lot of species growing in any given area, and that's all at once. And there are, if you look at it throughout the year, there will sometimes be some things that are there in the early spring that are not there later on, some things that are there in the fall that were not there in the early spring, and so forth. So you can see a whole lot of different, you can really surprise yourself if you're not familiar with it by the diversity of plants that are growing around you. And the neat thing about that is that pretty much all of them have medicinal properties. We don't always know what they are. Not all of them have a very strong traditional history of use, but lots and lots of them do. Lots and lots of them do, because people have lived alongside these plants all these years, all these millennia, and it's not just a matter of trial and error. It's partly that people use to discover how plants work. It's partly a matter of recognition. If you are used to medicinal plants and you taste an unfamiliar plant, you can often tell some things about that plant's properties from the way it tastes, and also the way it smells, and sometimes even the way it feels. So there are a lot of methods of what might fancily be called organoleptic analysis, where you can use your own senses to analyze what's going on with a plant and what is in it. And that's not the most reliable method to find out what a plant might do, but it is a really good method for recognizing whether quality of a particular sample of a plant is good. So if you have an herb that you know is supposed to smell and taste a certain way and it barely has that smell and taste, you know that it's not very good quality. If it has it very strongly, you know that's the good stuff. So that's a good thing to pay attention to with herbs that you work with. Don't just think of them as a name and a set of properties. Think of them as an actual organic thing that's going to have certain smells, tastes, things like that. Not just the actions of what this plant's for or what it does, but all sorts of things in terms of what it might be useful for. Hang on just a second. Let's see. So as you go around, try and notice some of these types of environments that are around you. Some other things that you might notice are differences in what grows in a shady area versus what grows in a more sunny area, even in the same yard, even in the same small field or whatever. And also the amount of wetness that something might get. So if you're alongside a stream, for instance, there will be different plants often growing right along the stream than there are even several feet away from the stream. And just that small of a difference can make a huge difference in distance, can make a huge difference in plant communities, for the very simple reason that there's more moisture and that the temperature is actually going to be a little bit different right next to the stream. And so, and also some plants use the stream to move around. Plants aren't as non-mobile as people think. I mean, they tend not to get up and walk around very much, but they often have ways of distributing themselves, distributing their seeds, their roots, branches, things like that, that sometimes will grow into a new plant. An example I like to point out to people when we're out in the woods is sycamore trees. Sycamore trees are a type of tree that grow along the river or along large streams, sometimes in other places, but they'll fall into a large body of water, get carried downstream, and then the branches that are standing upright when it runs aground will sometimes grow into new trunks. And so you'll have a sycamore that's laid on its side with 3 new sycamores coming up out of it, or 3 new trunks coming up out of what was the original trunk. So, you know, they can actually go on little river trips when it floods and grow someplace else, especially the younger ones. And so that's you know, not always what people think of as plant behavior, but plants are full of surprises. And there are a lot of plants whose roots or corms or rhizomes will wash downstream or wash downhill and grow somewhere other than where they were originally growing, things like that. They have various different ways of moving a little bit, sometimes getting carried a large distance. Especially seeds can get carried vast distances, but sometimes other plant parts that grow into new plants can too. So noticing around you the different types of places, the different types of habitats, and which plants are in them. Now that might be hard if you don't know the plants yet, but notice that there are different plants, and if you know the names of them, that's good. And if you don't, we'll learn more about that as you go along, and I will help you to learn more about that on your own as well, because it is really important for herbalists to know the plants that they're working with and know the plants that are around them. And often, there are a lot of plants that I know pretty well that I don't use very much medicinally. For instance, there's a plant called fleabane that is blooming right now, and there's a bunch of it in yards in my neighborhood, and there was some in my yard, but I picked some and put it in a bouquet and I mowed the rest because my neighbors would get mad if I don't do that once in a while. But I don't really use fleabane, but I know that where fleabane grows, there's going to be some other things too. That fleabane is kind of what you might call an indicator species for a certain type of ground. It tends to grow in yards, especially yards that have not been aggressively maintained and poisoned and so forth. So a lot of the time you'll see fleabane. You can be driving along and see a field of fleabane, and you can probably know just from that there's probably going to be chickweed, there's probably going to be ground ivy and henbit, and various different plants that I do use medicinally that will often grow in the same place that fleabane grows, even though fleabane is kind of conspicuous to see from further away. It has a big, well, not really big, it has a cluster of small daisy-like flowers on it. So it's quite recognizable. So that's a good thing. One of the really good things to start doing if you want to start seeing the world as an herbalist and you want to start building your connection to the land and to the plants is to notice which plants around you grow in which places and try to remember it. And you might be surprised how good the human mind is at remembering where you've seen a particular plant. I think it is kind of an innate skill set that a lot of us tend to have and, you know, could easily go through life without ever using. But people often surprise themselves by their ability to do this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of how we recognize plants and how we talk about plants, and then I'm going to go into the Materia Medica part of tonight's class and talk about two specific plants. So the one thing you'll notice if you read much about herbal medicine, like if you're reading about, like on my website or my Instagram, for instance, usually if I talk about a plant, I'll call it some name, and then I will put up some parentheses and call it by a different name that's two Latin words. And those are Latin binomials. Some people are really used to them, some people have encountered them before, and some people never have. They are very seldom actually the Latin names of the plants. In some cases they are, especially plants that the ancient Romans actually had names for, because a lot of plants weren't necessarily known to those people. But for the most part, they're names that have been assigned in modern or relatively modern times to the plants. The first name is a genus name, which is a closely related group of plants. For example, mentha, which is the true mints. Not the entire mint family, but all of the actual ones that are very closely related to spearmint. So there's spearmint itself, which is Mentha spicata. There's pennyroyal, which is Mentha pelagium, and so forth. There's several of them. And they all have the name mentha as the first part of their Latin name. And that lets you know that they have certain features, that they have certain patterns to the way the plant is set up. They all have a square stem, they all have a particular shape of flower, and they all have a similar shape of leaf. So all of the menthas are similar in that way. And then the species name is a smaller group that is just that one type of plant. So Mentha spicata is strictly spearmint. And that's, I guess the idea of what exactly constitutes a species is a little bit nebulous, but it should be a fairly closely related group of plants that are the same kind of plant. Sometimes plants can interbreed with plants that we don't consider their same species, so sometimes there are some differences within a species where people have bred them for particular traits, especially, that we still call them the same species. For example, Capsicum annuum is cayenne pepper, and there are lots of different peppers. There are lots of different intensities of capsicum. So you can have capsicum, well, for example, bell pepper is basically, it's the same species, it's just a different cultivar. It's not spicy. Paprika is another one that's in the same species. It's a different breed. It's not really spicy either, but it's used as a flavoring and coloring. So cayenne is actually hot and actually has a lot of medicinal properties from its hotness, from the same substances in it that make it hot. So we call them all the same species, even though there are some differences. But in general, plants that are the same species ought to be very closely related. And when you're talking about wild plants, usually they all look pretty close to the same. You know, there are some differences in size and things like that, but they can be depending on growing conditions. But they should look pretty much the same, have the same flower shape, the same leaf shape, the same stem texture, and that sort of thing. So that's something to keep in mind as we as you're learning about plants, that if you see something that doesn't look quite right, it's probably a different species. So yeah, there's more, a lot more complexity in how plants are categorized. They're categorized in families, for instance, and even larger groupings than that. But for the moment, genus and species is something to be aware of. Sometimes it can be kind of daunting to learn those Latin names because they're unfamiliar, and because if you're not talking to other plant people, you probably never hear them spoken. You know, everybody knows what a dandelion is, but Taraxacum officinale is not necessarily a name that anyone ever speaks aloud when they're talking about dandelions, because we're always talking about the same thing when we talk about a dandelion. So with that one, it doesn't matter as much. But there are some things like snakeroot, for instance. There are a lot of plants in this world that are called snakeroot. I'm not exactly sure why. Sometimes it's because the root looks like a snake. Sometimes it's because the root was used for treating snake bite. So there are a whole bunch of plants that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other in terms of what they do medicinally, or in terms of what they look like, or what plant families they're a part of, or anything like that, that are all called snakeroot. And so that's an area where having the Latin name really clarifies that. You know, having, if I say Rauwolfia serpentaria, that only refers to one plant. There's only one plant ever that's called that. So that's you know, a much more specific way to talk about a plant, and a much clearer way to communicate. I try to avoid jargon and speak in plain language as much as possible, but Latin names actually are really helpful. They're really useful, a useful system for making sure that you're talking about the right plant. And that can be a really difficult thing if you're reading older herbal texts, because people don't always mean the plant you think that they mean. So that's you know, something to be aware of. If you are reading something that's more than a couple hundred years old, it doesn't indicate what the Latin name of the plant is. Or if you're reading a post on the internet from somebody who just doesn't use Latin binomials, and they might not specify what they're talking about, you might have to say, oh wait, are we talking about, you know, the snakeroot that grows at the edge of the woods here in Kentucky, or are we talking about the snakeroot that grows in India? You know, it's kind of a different thing you might have to clarify. But I encourage everybody to familiarize themselves with the Latin names of the plants as you're learning them. So that's, and I very much encourage everybody to start familiarizing themselves with the plants that grow where you live. And so I mentioned this on Sunday, for those of you who were there, that one of the projects that I want to have you do is a plant collection where you catalog and write a little bit about a bunch of different plants that live where you live. And you can do this either by taking pictures of them, or by pressing specimens of them and gluing them to paper, which is the old-fashioned way of doing it. You can either create a paper copy or a PDF or something like that. But when you do this, and you can start doing this right away, you don't necessarily have to learn the plants before you collect them. But when you do this, make sure that you are able to see in the picture, or that you collect as a specimen, the leaf and the flower, and preferably the stem too. and it's probably a good idea to make a note of what date you found it on. And that will help you later with identifying it, and it will make it so that someone who looks at it can see that that's actually what plant they're talking about. For example, there's two plants that are very common around here right now, dandelion and chicory. And before chicory blooms, it looks a lot like dandelion. If you put a dandelion leaf and a chicory leaf together, and you just had the leaf and not the flower, I'm not sure I would. I might misrecognize which was which. But if you have the flower, there's no question. There's no doubt about it. One of them has a blue flower and one of them has a yellow flower. If you have the stem, there's no doubt about that either, because one of them has a tall branching stem with leaves on it, and one of them has a very short hollow stem with no leaves. So you can tell them apart very easily. So as you're collecting plants, be sure to get leaf and flower and stem if possible. You know, if it's a tree, don't bother taking the stem. You know, that's going to be too hard to press the trunk of a tree between pages of a book. But in most cases, you'll want to have the stem that the flower is on as well as the leaf. So that is a project that is not too soon to begin, but we'll get more specific guidance on that as we go along. And that is a really good way to familiarize yourself with the plant. It's very hands-on. It's something that I did early on in my development as an herbalist that I feel like was a very pivotal moment for me, a very pivotal part of the learning process for me, because I really got to understand plants in a much different way than I had previously gotten just from having plants pointed out to me and someone telling me, you know, that's gooseberry or that's stinging nettle. And I could recognize them, but I couldn't really describe them very well to another person. And I got better with that as I spent more time, you know, kind of cataloging them. Just a second. All right. So I wanted to talk about two specific plants today, and my plan is each time we do this to talk about two specific plants and kind of get to know these plants as well as we can in a short amount of time. And tonight, one of the plants I want to talk about is dandelion. Dandelion's Latin name is Taraxacum officinale. It's a member of the aster family, Asteraceae, which sometimes is called compositae in some works. Both words mean the same thing. It's the family that contains a lot of different plants. It's a huge plant family that contains dandelions and sunflowers and asters and lettuce and lots of other things. So it's a member of a very large plant family, and of course it's known on sight to many people. A lot of us made decorations out of it when we were children, or used the flowering the seed heads to make wishes on and that sort of thing. Like I said before, it's native to Europe or Asia and has spread around the world from there in temperate areas. It is a ruderal species. It's a weed. It grows in yards. It grows in gardens. It grows without people planting it. And people do also plant it. It is also a crop. It's grown for its edible leafy green. And it's also a source of pollen and nectar for bees at the time that it grows, although it doesn't have a lot of nectar compared to some other plants. But it blooms fairly early in the season. So it's kind of one of the first plants to bloom, one of the last plants to stop blooming, and the ones that are plants that bloom before it, and most of them are very inconspicuous. So it's something you can see early in the spring. You're like, oh, the dandelions are blooming. And really be able to see them sometimes taking over whole fields and stuff like that. So, medicinally, there are two main parts of the dandelion that are used medicinally. Really, all parts of the dandelion can be used medicinally and have been used medicinally for different things. The two main things that are used in herbal medicine that have some research into them, that you could probably go into an herb shop and find, that sort of thing, would include the leaf and the root. And these are essentially two different medicines. I keep them in my clinic as two separate medicines. And you could make something that included both of them, you know, a whole plant extract, and people do that too. But fundamentally, they're a bit different. The root is bitter, has an earthy taste, and it contains a white milky sap when it's fresh. The whole plant contains a white milky sap when it's fresh. The milky sap is bitter, and the root is bitter and sweet. So when I say sweet, it doesn't necessarily mean it tastes sugary. It means just that it's a little bit sweet. It's starchy. It has some carbohydrates in it. And so when someone eats dandelion root or drinks a tea made from dandelion root, it does a few different things. The first thing it does, when you put it in your mouth and you taste bitterness, that immediately starts provoking the release of certain digestive substances, especially bile from the liver. So your body gets this message that you've eaten something bitter. Your primitive instincts think, oh, this person has eaten poisonous plants again. Time to start pumping out the bile to detoxify them. And so your body produces this bile that, if you had eaten some poisonous plants, would kind of neutralize the alkaloids in them somewhat and make their impact less dramatic on you. As it happens, dandelion isn't really poisonous, so you're getting this effect without the actual poison. And it's making more digestive juices be released into your digestive system. These digestive juices change how your body metabolizes fat and can make it so people who are not absorbing as many calories from their food are more able to. And they may also, and are kind of traditionally interpreted as, making the liver work harder to detoxify the bloodstream. In other words, they might help to remove foreign substances from the bloodstream if it were done in a large amount. Now, the whole concept of cleansing and detoxifying is something that you come across in traditional healing from all around the world. It's a very common way of looking at things. It's a little bit at odds with the way people in the West usually think about how the body works. So sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, there's no such thing as detoxifying, there's no such thing as cleansing. And that's not really true. When people talk about this in a traditional context, they do mean something. Although there are a lot of people who make claims about it that are exaggerated or that are just kind of off the mark. So to speak of it as plainly as I can, it appears that it is going to increase the circulation through the liver. It's going to increase the output of the liver of certain digestive enzymes. If you take enough of it, it will make someone have loose stools that have a sort of greenish color to them, and that's kind of the body just sort of pouring bile into the digestive system and the peristalsis pushing that on through the body. So sometimes that can be helpful if someone has very sluggish digestion, if someone's not having bowel movements and not having a lot of digestion and not having a lot of appetite. A strong dose of dandelion root can really help with that. Traditionally, a lot of the time people would take it as a spring tonic, something that you would take in the springtime after eating preserved food all winter, eating food that was maybe not a lot of fresh stuff during the winter time. And that sometimes would help with the bowels being regular and just sort of promote a general sense of well-being that is kind of hard to say exactly what is going on with it physiologically. But the understanding is that they do help the liver, that the roots are helpful to the liver, provoking and strengthening to the liver because of the bitterness in them. Additionally, dandelion roots contain a lot of polysaccharides, which are carbohydrates, starches, and one of the main ones that is in dandelion is called inulin. Inulin is, it's not a super long chain carbohydrate, but it is a complex carbohydrate, and it is one that a lot of starches that you eat get broken down by your saliva and turned into sugar and absorbed into your bloodstream as sugar. So saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which breaks these starches down into small pieces, basically sugars, and they get converted into glucose and absorbed into the bloodstream. And then maybe they get restored as fat or as energy, or they get used as energy or whatever. And that's the normal thing that happens when you digest carbs. The carbs in some plant roots are a little bit different because some of them are not really able to be broken down through that particular pathway. And inulin is an example of that. The starches in dandelion root are an example of that. So when you eat them, you don't really digest them, and they don't get absorbed in your upper part of your small intestine for the most part. A little bit of them does. But mostly they don't get absorbed in your small intestine. They pass on through, and then the bacteria further down in your intestines, in your bowels, will actually use these starches to grow on. So they can really help to promote healthy flora in the intestines. And so not only can they decrease constipation, but they can help to provide a good growing environment for some of the starch-feeding gut flora, things like lactobacillus and acidophilus, which are probably present in your digestive tract all the time, but they're not necessarily able to take hold and grow in the way that they need to be in some people. And in some people they overgrow if the bowels are not moving, but dandelion helps with that too. So taking dandelion root extract, especially an extract, if it's a strong tincture that's mostly alcohol, it's not going to have a lot of the starches in it. They don't like to dissolve in alcohol. They don't like to dissolve in cold water either. They're soluble in hot water. And when that cools, sometimes they stay in solution and sometimes they precipitate out of the solution. So a hot tea is a great way to get dandelion root into somebody's body. A cold tea might not have as much of it in them, or some of it might fall out as it's cooling, and then it just kind of is like a sediment in the liquid, and it's still okay to take it in that form. But that's something that helps with gut flora, and we're finding out that gut flora does a lot more than just help with digestion. Gut flora appears to be very relevant to mental health, to the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and acetylcholine and so forth. So it's actually got, and also to have an effect on the endocrine system as well. So it's turning out that gut flora is hugely important, and that all of our ancestors ate food that contained these kinds of starches. There's something that's supposed to be in our diet, but they're not really necessarily found in any of the staple crops that people eat a lot of. I mean, they're in beets and carrots and things like that, but not everybody eats those on a daily basis. Dandelion is a very rich source of that type of carbohydrate, as well as the bitter substances. When I make dandelion into an extract, I do it a couple of different ways, but one of my favorite things to do is to slice the root into small pieces, let it soak in a little bit of alcohol, and then add hot water to that. And I usually want to do something along the lines of 1 part of dandelion root, 1 part of alcohol, and 2 parts hot water. And so that's usually, we'll produce something that's getting out the bitter compounds that do come out in the alcohol, and then also getting out the sweet compounds, the starches that only come out in the hot water.
Really fast, you said it was 1 part dandelion, 1 part alcohol, and 2 parts water?
2 parts hot water, yes.
Thank you.
I boil the water in the electric kettle and then pour it over the roots with the alcohol already added to them, and that usually works pretty well. Usually do a lot of agitating after that, shaking it up, stirring it, that sort of thing, to make sure I get all this, as much of the starches as possible out of the root.
How long do you let that sit?
Weeks. It really is probably good by morning, but I usually let it sit for a couple of weeks. It's preserved, so it's you know, the alcohol is going to keep it from going bad, so you can let it sit for as long as you want to, but I usually give it a while to make sure that it's dissolving the stuff that's in it. Traditionally, a month is like a good rule of thumb for making tinctures, letting them steep for a month. Most of them really don't take that long, but if you do it for that long, then you know, you can be pretty sure that you've done it long enough. I've also had things given to me that were tinctured, that had been in tincture for years. I actually had someone bring me a 1 pound wild Chinese ginseng root one time, which is, there can't be many of those in the world, but it was given to this person as a gift, and they didn't really feel like they had any use for it, so they gave it to me. And it was like actually a jar of roots, but in the center there was a 1 pound ginseng root, which was absolutely, it's, you know, enormous. By far the biggest Chinese ginseng root that I've ever seen, and I've only seen a few American ginseng roots that were that size. So, yeah, usually I let a dandelion root tincture steep for a couple of weeks. If you want things to set up faster, if you want tinctures to get done faster, 2 main ways that you can do that are by breaking the herbal material up into smaller pieces and creating movement in the tincture, either through shaking, stirring, repeatedly pouring the liquid through the solid material, something like that. But you creating the movement and breaking the material up into smaller pieces, both will speed up the process pretty significantly. Heat will keep.
First?
With dandelion root, I don't. It's harder to work with when it's dry. If I am going to dry it, I slice it up into little pieces and then dry those, and that's fine. But the starches change a little bit when it dries, like just kind of like an apple. If you cut it, it turns brown. A dandelion root does too, not quite as in quite as pronounced of a way. But so usually I just slice it up pretty fresh and use it right away. You can dry it though. It loses a lot of its weight, so you don't. Well, yeah, it loses a lot of its weight if you dry it. It gets because a lot of its weight's just water, but yeah, I usually just slice it up and use it, make it into medicine right away. So
how do you determine the dosage for that?
Well, it's very flexible because dandelion is very well tolerated. Usually I would start out with a teaspoon of it. That's kind of a lot of the time where I like to start with tinctures. And that is, I will say, a larger dose than what a lot of people use. Some people like to use a few drops of a tincture. I feel like when you do that, it's almost like a homeopathic dose. It's like something that your body can taste it, but you're not really getting a large dose of, or necessarily an actual active dose of the substances with most herbs. And that's not true of all herbs, because some of them are very potent. But for the most part, if you take a spoonful of a tincture, you're going to get a dosage that's going to change some things about how your body is working on a cellular and molecular level that you wouldn't get from just taking a few drops. So I like to use 5 milliliters as a starting dose. With dandelion, if you get too much, with dandelion root, if you get too much, what happens is that you get diarrhea, and then you can scale back the dose from there. You know, so sometimes some people like to keep increasing the dose of mild herbs like that until somebody starts to feel sick, and then back off a little bit. And that's one way to go about it. It can be kind of harsh sometimes to do it that way, but that is one way to go about it. And it is safe with safe herbs like dandelion. You know, you don't really have, in all the ages that we've been using dandelion, you don't really have a lot of examples of it going real badly, you know. So it's tends to be a very safe herb. So that's the root.
Really fast, if you were to eat the root without making a tincture, like can you just use the root, how much would you use?
Like if you're just eating the root,
Yeah.
it wouldn't taste very good, but I would probably like say somewhere around a spoonful of the root, or just maybe like 1 or 2 inch long sections of root.
Okay, heard, thank you.
Yeah. So
Um,
sorry, I didn't catch that.
Also, could you explain how do you live in? I'm sorry, hear me?
Yeah. Now I can't.
Sorry, it's storming here. How long do you use alcohol before I put it in the water?
How long do I leave it in the alcohol before I put it in the water? Maybe an hour. Just a little bit of time.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mostly what I'm wanting to do with the alcohol is when you slice it up, you'll get some sap leaking out of it, some latex, some milky white sap. In my language, you call it bankikean, which means breast milk of birds. I don't know why it's called that really, but I think it's kind of a cute name. But you get that milky white sap that comes out of it, and the alcohol will kind of wash that off and absorb it into the alcohol. And so that's where a lot of the bitter principle is in that white latex. So it's so basically I leave it in there for about an hour, but what I'm mostly trying to accomplish with it is for that particular substance to get assimilated into the liquid, which can happen pretty quickly, especially if you shake it. So that's dandelion root, and then the next part of the dandelion that I want to talk about is the leaf. So dandelion leaf is often regarded as a completely separate medicine, and where dandelion root's main affinity is for the liver, dandelion leaf also has a strong effect on the kidneys. Well, a noticeable effect on the kidneys, not necessarily strong compared to some other kidney medicines, but a noticeable effect on the kidneys. It's a diuretic, so it means it provokes the production of more urine. So it does that by containing acids that are a little bit, I guess you could say, mildly irritating or at least stimulating to the tissue of the kidneys. And So that acid gets into the kidneys, and then the kidneys are trying to wash that acid out, and in the process of doing so, they have to put through a lot of fluid, so it increases the output of urine. And that can be really helpful in a number of clinical scenarios. If somebody has a very mild UTI, drinking dandelion leaf tea or taking dandelion leaf tincture or just eating dandelion leaves as salad greens will, if it's done with extra water especially, will cause more water to go through the urinary tract, and it will also make the urine more alkaline. So it's going to change the pH of the urine and tend to make it a less habitable place for certain microorganisms. So if somebody has a mild UTI, and this isn't what I would use for a more serious situation, but if they just have a little bit of irritation and that sort of thing, dandelion leaf can help with that. If somebody's retaining water, especially after hard work, or if it's something that's happening in part of their menstrual cycle, if they're having like some swelling in their hands and feet and that sort of thing, dandelion will actually also help to remove that excess fluid from the system. So it can be really good for that. And because dandelion leaf contains potassium, it tends to get rid of sodium while increasing the amount of potassium in the system, which can be favorable for people who have, for some people whose blood pressure is elevated. It can help the body to regulate that a little bit better. And so it's often a really useful thing for people who are having difficulties with maintaining a consistent blood pressure, is that it will help with the balance of sodium and potassium, which are both electrolytes. They both kind of work to change how electricity is conducted in the body, which has an effect on how tense the lining of the blood vessels is. And then at the same time, by removing fluid from the system, you're decreasing the pressure in the circulatory system. So both of those things together can have a positive effect on blood pressure. Additionally, dandelion is just kind of a nutritious green. It contains vitamin C, it contains vitamin A, it has fiber that can positively affect the digestive system. So it's actually a pretty good plant for the digestive system and for as a nutritive as well. It's just something that it's kind of gives your body a little bit of some things that it might be lacking, like minerals. Dandelion will grow in it will grow in very poor soil, but if it's growing in soil where there are good minerals, it will help accumulate those minerals and potentially make it pass it on to the person that's eating it. So it's actually something that can kind of soak up a lot of nutrition from its environment and pass that on to the person consuming it. So that's a good thing about dandelion. It's a nutritious green, and it's a diuretic. It does also contain some of the same bitter stuff that's in the dandelion root. It just doesn't contain it in anywhere near the same intensity. So on the whole, dandelion leaves taste sour and a little bit bitter, whereas the roots taste bitter and a little bit sweet. So the dandelion leaves contain acids, and the sap with the bitter latex in it. The roots contain the same bitter sap, and then also starches. So you get some of the same substances and some different substances, and an overall situation where the most pronounced outwardly visible effect of the root is on the liver and the digestive system, and the most visible effect of the leaf is on the kidneys and urinary tract. Yeah, it would be great if dandelion greens became the next big fad health food. they're very nutritious. And you can, back in April, I made a salad that I just had, fresh dandelion greens in it. The thing about dandelion greens to be aware of is that the longer they've been out in the sun, the more bitter they get. And this is true of lettuce and some other plants too, but people who are harvesting dandelions, if you're wanting to eat them, you probably want to get them earlier in the year when the sun is not as intense, or when they're small and fresh. If you're getting if you see dandelion growing in the ground, it's like a big, what we call a basal rosette. So it's at the base of the plant, right against the ground, and rosette because it's kind of like all growing out in a flowery type shape. So the ones that are closest to the center of that, the smallest, newest ones, are going to be less bitter than the bigger, larger ones towards the outside. So if you're gathering it with the intention of eating it, you want the small leaves or the leaves from early spring. And if you get the really big leaves in the high summertime, they're going to be probably too bitter for you to eat, depending on your individual tastes and how much oil and vinegar you put on them. So
I say throw it all in the salad.
yeah, so that's something to be aware of if you're going to forage dandelions. And of course, with any of these things, there's a certain etiquette to it and a certain set of safety procedures. And one of the most obvious things is you don't want to gather something if you don't know if it's been sprayed with weed killer or something like that. And you don't want to gather things from people's yards who might not want you in their yard, that kind of thing. And you don't want to gather from places that are close to traffic, places where there would be a lot of runoff from the road onto the plants, because then the plants are going to be drinking up things like radiator fluid, and there's probably still some lead in the soil from the days of leaded gasoline and so forth. So you want to gather as much as possible from clean places, and places where you can be relatively sure that it hasn't been exposed to anything truly nasty. Let's see, how am I doing on time here? Yeah, great.
How far from the road would you recommend staying?
Probably like 2 of the width of the road, something like that. I've heard people say things like 10 miles from the road. I think that's a little bit unlikely. I mean, I'm hardly ever actually 10 miles from any roads, I don't even, there aren't too many places like that around here. But you definitely want to be, a couple times the width of the road away from the road before you would be safe from stuff running off into it. It also kind of depends on if it's downhill from the road, and if runoff from the road is going to go to it. You don't want that either. So it kind of depends some, but keep in mind that most of the stuff that you would buy from the produce section at the grocery store is not grown a great distance from roads necessarily either. But it's kind of just a matter of what you think it's likely to have been exposed to, and like I said, whether there's runoff from the road going to where the plants are or not is a big consideration. And at the least some distance, several yards away from the road, and it kind of depends too on how much of a road it is. Is it a road that a few cars a day go down, or is it a road that's packed with traffic all day long? That can be quite a bit of difference in terms of how much exhaust and how much brake dust and that sort of thing is likely to get on it. But those things don't usually travel. They dissipate fairly fast or fall out of the air fairly fast the further you get away from the road. So, most of the stuff that I gather here for use in the clinic, I try to be quite a ways from roads. If it's something that I'm gathering from the wild, I try to be a quarter mile or so from a road. But I also do grow things in my garden, and my garden is only about 200 feet from the nearest road. So it's kind of depends on, really not even 200 feet from the nearest road. More like 150, I guess. But, you know, it just sort of depends on what's between you and the road and that sort of thing, more than just purely a matter of distance.
If the habitat is trashy, I wouldn't use it for medicinal purposes.
Yeah, I wouldn't either if it's a trashy habitat. I really try to gather from clean places. It's kind of like you find something on the ground here, are you going to eat it? And if you wouldn't eat it, you don't want to use it medicinally either. So kind of depends on what's around it. Yeah, and you don't want to be like around where people are taking their dogs and things like that, or where there's, animals, livestock, things like that. You kind of got to be careful of all of that, and just sort of look around at what the area is exposed to, and what it's producing as a result. So,
Hey, Andrew, I have a little bit of a weird question,
mhm.
and it's pertaining to what you're talking about. So I live, there's a cattle farm kind of uphill from me,
Mhm.
and I mean, it's quite a ways away, but we have a natural spring that's underground, and it actually, I've always kind of been concerned about, like runoff from the cow manure, but it's a huge, huge plot of land with not a ton of cows. But
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of like dandelion, bed nettle, things like that growing. I mean, do you think that would be safe? This is like 30 acres, and then that one back there is about the same too. So it's not like it's like, congregated or anything like
Uh-huh.
that.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably pretty safe. If the water is safe to drink, I would say that the land is at least as safe. Um, and usually, I mean, the main thing with cows that you'd be concerned about would be E. coli. And depending on what the watershed looks like, that can be kind of hard to predict, like as far as whether everything's okay. But if it's just something where it's traveling through the ground in the water table, and then the plants are up here above that, there's not going to be direct bacterial contamination getting through. Now if it were like growing in the spring, like watercress
It's
growing
kind
in
of
the
rocky
spring,
too.
yeah, I would test the water for E. coli and see if there's it seems to be getting through, because a lot of the time water will go into the ground and it'll get filtered out, but not always, depending on what the lay of the land is like. And here in central Kentucky, we got this karst topography where the water can kind of drain through a few inches of dirt and then be in the cracks in the rock and then travel through basically underground streams without getting filtered much. So, it's possible for things like that to travel sometimes. Uh, but yeah.
It's also, we're kind of like in a bowl. It's weird. We're in a bowl surrounded by trees almost. So,
Uh,
so you have the rocks and you have the tree roots and you have all those things. I mean, my gut tells me it's probably fine because of all that. But, and like I said, it's not like a huge cattle farm. It's just more of like a hobby cattle farm. So the concentration level would not be something of huge concern. But I just, that's something I think about when, trying to forage. And we've
yeah.
eaten a few little things here and there, like chicken of the woods, mushrooms, things like that. Mushrooms are like a different thing, than just eating like a root.
For sure. Yeah, and I think a lot of the time things can feel like weird to us because if we're not used to them, or like, does it feel? Sometimes it feels, things that are wild can kind of feel unsafe because we don't know. Like a lot of the time people will be in the woods and they'll be like, oh, how do I know if this is not contaminated? But if they were to have it in their own garden, they wouldn't think the same thing about it. Which I don't know. It's probably okay. I can't say for sure without looking at the land and maybe testing the water and stuff like that. But it's probably all right.
I
There probably are. There are definitely places where you can collect the sample and send it to. I mean, I have a microscope and petri dishes and stuff like that, so I'm just kind of used to doing that sort of thing on my own. But
Home Depot has home like water tests. I don't know how accurate they are, but
they're reasonably accurate. If you can mess them up, but you can contaminate them, but they're reasonably accurate. Yeah. So I wanted to talk about.
you can also call your county's extension office, and there's ways to get your soil tested.
Oh yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I didn't know they did that. That's good. Yeah, county extension offices do. They do a lot of neat things, and people who aren't farmers don't really know about them usually. But anyway, so I wanted to talk about another plant. White pine is a plant that grows here. It's a tree. It's a medicinal tree with good medicinal properties. A variety of good medicinal properties. So, and it has different parts that are used medicinally. The white pine is one of, I think, 5 species of pine trees that are native here in Kentucky, and it grows throughout a pretty good chunk of the eastern United States. It has, it can be recognized because it has long needles with a white stripe along the length of them, and it has 5 needles to a bundle. So if you look at the needles, 5 of them will be growing out of a little base all together in a bundle, and that's how you recognize this particular species of pine tree, although pretty much everything I'm going to say about it applies to the other species of pine tree as well, of which there are many. There are just a few here in Kentucky, but there are many throughout the world. However, not everything with needles is a pine tree. So this doesn't necessarily apply to all conifers, a few of which are even poisonous, but it does apply to white pine, and it generally applies to other pine trees as well. The first thing, the easiest part of the plant to gather is the leaf. The needles are the leaves of this particular tree, and they don't all fall at the same time of year like they do on broadleaf trees, but they do fall throughout the year. A leaf will grow and live out its lifespan and then fall. So if you go to a white pine tree, there will be a lot of needles on the ground. The needles can be gathered pretty easily as long as the tree's not too tall, and you can make hot water extract out of them. You chop them up, drink the needles as a tea, and they are nutritious, and also they break up congestion. They contain some starches that help with gut flora, just like the, well, not just like, but as does the dandelion root. They also contain some substances called terpenes that do a bunch of different things. But the thing that's most noticeable with pine is that it will break up phlegm and congestion. So if somebody's got a lot of congestion, if they're hacking and coughing frequently, pine will really help to break that up, help to relieve the sense of stuffiness without causing drowsiness or overstimulation. So that's a really useful thing to know about white pine. The sap comes out of the plant when it's cut. Sometimes you can find large pieces of sap growing on the plant or that have exuded from the plant. Sometimes they will also come out when the plant is, if you cut a branch or something like that, a little bit will come out. It's harder to gather. It's very easy to gather a pound of pine needles. It's very difficult to gather a pound of pine sap. But the sap is a more concentrated medicine. It doesn't take as much of it. Traditionally, there have been a couple of different forms that's been taken in, one of which I don't really use, which is black pine tar. That's made by burning the branches and collecting the tar that comes out of them as they burn. And that has mostly been used as a topical application for skin issues. And you know, as the name suggests, it's black in color and it's very sticky, especially when it's heated. So that has been used sometimes as an adhesive for gluing together lacerations or other injuries. I have other things that I use in that capacity, so I don't really use it for that. And it's, you know, kind of a process to make, but it's a very traditional medicine that was very much used in the traditional medicine here in the eastern United States, in eastern Kentucky, as well as in other places where the tree grows. And so the white sap, the unburned tar, unburned pitch, it's called, sometimes it's called Pix alba, or just white pitch. That can be dissolved in a higher concentration of alcohol, 75% alcohol or so, and that will make a very strong decongestant. And it's actually been used as an inhalant for congestion as well, something that sort of decreases inflammation in the respiratory system. I don't really try to use it that way. I mostly used it as an internal medicine. And when you make it, if it's just the alcohol, it has like a clear yellow color. If you add it to water, it turns totally white and opaque. So that's something that I have used some during the course of the COVID pandemic for people with shortness of breath and difficulty breathing and stuff like that after having been sick. It's pretty useful for that, and it's another very traditional part of the use of the white pine. Another thing from the white pine that's been used medicinally or in a healing capacity is the bark. And the bark is stringy and sticky. And stringy and sticky can be a really useful combination. And if you have the tincture of the pitch, you can use it together with that. You can peel the inner bark. So there's a couple layers of the bark. There's the rough brown outside bark that you see, and then there's a very clean, clear white inner bark. And what I've done with that inner bark before is steamed it and used it actually to put over wounds, to put over injuries. And you can actually clean the area with the pitch tincture and then put the bandage over it. And it has this reputation, which appears to be correct in my case, in the cases that I've seen, although I don't exactly understand how this works, of being able to draw things out of wounds. So if somebody has a foreign object in a wound channel, it appears to be able to actually get that to come to the surface. And sometimes things like that will just work themselves to the surface on their own, and maybe that's all that's going on. Maybe it's just sealing the outside and keeping the wound channel from changing shape much, and maybe the pressure inside is pushing it to the surface. Like I said, I'm not sure exactly how that's going on, and I haven't had enough situations where I've been treating a wound with something in the wound to be sure that that's a consistent thing that can be relied upon. But in the few instances that I've used it, it actually has been helpful. So that's, not usually what you should do if somebody has a wound with something in it. But if you find yourself in a situation where someone does have a wound like that and you feel like there's not really another option but for you to treat it yourself, then that is something to know. Something that you can do is to be able to put some pitch over the area and put a steamed piece of sterile inner bark of white pine on it, and hopefully it'll draw out the foreign object. Apart from that dramatic example, though, the tincture of the sap is pretty strongly antiseptic, and it does form a barrier when it's applied to things like injuries, scrapes, cuts, things like that. So it will kill any germs that are in them, and then it will also help to keep any new ones from getting in. So that's actually pretty useful on a first aid type of basis if you find yourself in an area where you're using your herbal medicine skills to support people's health for minor injuries.
Andrew, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, on the white sap, when you're making that tincture, is that like a 1-to-1 ratio, plant to menstruum?
I usually do 2-to-1, 2 parts of liquid to 1 part of the sap itself. So,
Okay.
You could try it at a higher concentration, but I'm not sure how it would go. I think that it would end up being kind of thick if you did it 1-to-1, that it would be like, that it would have more the consistency of sap with some alcohol in it rather than a tincture with sap in it.
And you did say 75% alcohol, is that correct?
Yeah, 75% or better. So that's 150 proof or better for those who like that particular system of measurement.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just a second here. Oh. So, and then white pine also has a couple of other parts that are used medicinally in various different capacities. One of them is the pollen, the pine pollen. A lot of people think that pine pollen has testosterone in it. It doesn't really, or at least if it does, it doesn't have any meaningful amount. There have been some different people who have looked at it and done measurements on it to see what was in it. And some people have reported testosterone in it, but I don't really think that it does contain testosterone at all. But if it does, it's in very small quantities. Testosterone is kind of more of an animal thing. I mean, it's basically based on cholesterol, which is more of an animal type molecule, and a metabolic pathway found in animals, not really in plants. So I'm not really sure how it would go about getting testosterone. But some people, you can definitely find any number of people claiming that pine pollen has testosterone in it. And I think that that's kind of because it's the male gamete of the pine tree that people think that it's kind of like, basically tree sperm. So it doesn't actually have that in it, but it has been used by people for energy and stamina, and while it's not going to have an androgenic effect, it's not going to make people grow facial hair or, have an anabolic steroid type effect on muscle growth. But it is something that people can take that does appear to give them more energy. People have also mixed pine pollen into baked goods and things like that and used it as a sort of a flour additive. So it's got some nutritive properties to it, and it does seem to be sort of what you might call adaptogenic, something that can promote energy and promote stamina and that sort of thing, even though whatever mechanism of action that is involved there probably does not actually involve testosterone in any way. But pine pollen and the male cones, I don't know if you know about male pine cones, but pine trees have two types of cones. First, they have these small ones that produce lots of dusty pollen. Pine is wind pollinated mostly. It's not pollinated by insects. It just produces clouds and clouds of pollen that get blown all over by the wind, and some of them end up on another pine tree. And then there's the female cones, which are what people usually think of when they're thinking of pine cones. And those, you're used to probably seeing them when they fall off of the tree, and they're basically like a hard woody texture. When they're small, they're green or sometimes purplish, but they're soft. If you bite into them, they're very sour and sweet. And these can actually be made into a sort of syrup. You can slice them up and cook them, and the starches in them come out, and the little bit of the pine type resin that comes out, and some other things. People make this into, sometimes people add sugar to it, but you don't really have to add sugar to it. It's sweet on its own to some extent, but people do add sugar to it, and sometimes people also add pectin to it and make jam out of it. So you can make pine cone jelly, you can make pine cone syrup, you can allow it to ferment with some yeast, either with or without adding sugar to it, and you can make sort of a pine cone fizzy, mildly alcoholic, I guess you could call it beer. Something on the order of beer. It's not really beer. Pine cone ale, which is more commonly done with spruce tips, which if you have spruces around and you know what spruces are, they have tips on them right now, green growing tips on them right now where I live. So it would be the right time to harvest those to make spruce needle beer, if you're into that sort of thing. But people make various things of that nature out of the pine cones when they're green, and they it has some of this, a little bit of the same decongestant properties, quite a bit of the nutritive properties that the pine needles have. So that is also an edible part of the plant. So there was a forager who wrote a few books in the mid-20th century called Yule Gibbons, and he did a commercial, I guess it was back in the 70s, where he talked about how every part of the pine tree is edible, and it was kind of meant to be funny, but most of what is in a pine tree is edible. You really wouldn't want to eat the wood in particular. I mean, I suppose you could, but it's not good for you.
Have you heard of the pine bacon that people are making?
No.
Like, I don't mean this ironically. Okay, so they're shaving off the really tender part of the tree, like the white bark, and cooking it like bacon in a pan and eating it. I've got friends who are like, "Yeah, you're in the forge and you like pine bacon," and I'm like, "I don't know."
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that. I have eaten the bark, the inner bark, just kind of nibbled on it, and I've also shredded it up and cooked it in with things like oatmeal or something like that. Most people really don't like the taste of pine. If you're not used to it, like, I don't know. I grew up around people who did chew on pine pitch and chew on pine needles and things like that, and it was kind of like, I think when I started doing it, it was sort of like the same reason that a lot of people take up smoking, is like because the older kids were doing it and it seems tough or whatever. But like, so to me it tastes kind of nostalgic, but a lot of people who taste pine are like, okay, this tastes like a cleaning product. That's kind of like, pine sol is kind of what comes to mind for a lot of people when they taste it, and it's not necessarily a very it's outside the flavor profile of what people in our culture are used to, for sure. the pine bacon seems like it would be stringy, but I do feel like maybe I'll try that sometime.
Well, I'll send you the recipe that my buddy sent me. I ain't tried it yet, but I'll pass it along. You tell me what you think.
Interesting. I kind of have to wonder if this is like something that people tried and liked, or whether they're like, hey, let's see if we can get anybody to do this. But yeah, it's just plausible enough that it might be worth trying. But yeah, so as you can see with both dandelion and pine, both of these are very common plants. Both of them are, I feel like, pretty familiar plants. And they are both things that have not just medicinal properties, but that are, for one thing, extremely versatile in what they can do medicinally, each of them. And secondly, they're extremely well tolerated, not things that you can easily overdose on, and they're not very environmentally sensitive either, so they're not things that you can easily take too much of. So that's some what I consider really good criteria for herbs to start with. Things that that you can identify easily, that you can gather as much of as you want to without having to worry too much about the ecological impact of it, and that you can use pretty freely and try out on yourself and your friends and things like that, and family members, without having to worry that you might be messing something up and causing a really bad problem. So that's all. Those are all good attributes for beginning plants to have, and so those will be attributes that most of the plants that we talk about early on in this course share, because I want everybody to be able to start right away with using herbs if you're not already, and we all talked about that, and everybody wrote a little bit about that in the application, but I feel like that it's more than a life's work to learn everything about herbs, but that even what you can learn in a couple hours can be really useful to you, and you can use this information for the rest of your life once you've learned the basics of what a plant is for. You know that for the rest of your life, and you can use it whenever you want. So no amount of learning about it is too small, and no amount is ever the end. So I really like that about herbal medicine and about the practice of herbalism. I think that it's one of my favorite things about it, and I said this Sunday to those of you who were here then, is that it's the most widely used form of medicine in the world, precisely because it's the most accessible form of medicine in the world, and it's something that belongs to the people as a whole, to humanity as a whole, and it's not anybody's. Nobody owns the plants as species. They're not like intellectual property or patented or copyrighted or anything like that. They're things that are in our environment and don't necessarily belong to anybody or adhere to any particular laws or rules. They're just kind of wild things in their own right, and so I feel like it's good to build an understanding of these things and be able to use them, and hopefully to be able to work towards making the world a better place for the herbs, and use the herbs to make the world a better place for people as well. So that's what I'm going to try and help everybody do in the course of this 52-week class. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I've talked about?
I do.
Okay.
First of all, I wanted to say I'm very excited. I love the last thing you said. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
I'm super hyped to get started. Also, I was wondering, we talked about how you can get sap from the white pine by burning it. You can get the black pine tar, but is there like a way to do it that doesn't involve burning? Like a good way to do it that you would recommend?
Well, so that's to get the black sap. I mean, black tar. The black tar comes from when it's been burned. It's the same sap. But so the other way to get it is by cutting a branch, or sometimes you find it just leaking from cracks in the bark normally, and sometimes it can accumulate into like large globs, and sometimes it's just a little drip here and there. So a lot of the time what I do when I want to gather this is I'll have a clean, empty can, a metal can that I don't care if it never gets clean again, because it's not going to. Once the pine attaches to it, it will be sticky forever. But get a knife or something like that and scrape off pieces that I find on the bark, or if need be, to sacrifice a branch, to cut part of the branch off and gather the pine that leaks out of it, the sap that leaks out of it, and then cut it closer to the trunk and gather some more that leaks out of it. I don't do it that way very often because it's kind of slow going. It can take hours between the time that a branch is cut and the time that there's a meaningful amount of sap that has leaked out of it. So usually I try and find places where there's accumulations of sap already on the bark, and just sort of scrape those off with a pocket knife, and scrape them from the pocket knife into a can.
So what is generally a good amount, I guess? Like a good safe, should we be going for like a tablespoon of sap? Is that a good goal to be useful?
That's a great goal. That's a great goal. If you get a tablespoon of sap, you can make 1.5 ounces of tincture or so out of it, and that would be a nice sized little bottle that you can carry around for your first aid kit, or keep in your pantry or whatever, wherever you keep your medicines. And that's a decent amount to have for personal use, because it doesn't really take very much of it to be useful, and you don't need it all that often. So yeah, if you got a tablespoon, that would be a great amount to start with. Depending on where you go and how many trees you're visiting and stuff like that, it's not outside the realm of possibility to get several ounces of it, but sometimes you can only get a little bit, and it only takes a little bit. So if you got a tablespoon of it and you made that into tincture, that would be a perfectly fine amount to have.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question if nobody else does.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we talked about the male pine cones being small and dusty, so that's a good place to get pollen. The female pine cones, you can use them green and make stuff with them. Is there a good use for the larger woody female pine cones?
I don't use them for anything other than throwing them in the fire because they burn nicely.
Throwing them in, oh yeah.
Yeah. Burning them. They're really good tinder, I guess you'd say, but they're very woody, and they don't have like much to them besides the structural substances, the cellulose and whatever. So I haven't really tried to use them medicinally or talked to anyone else who has.
And then, what is a good method for collecting pollen? I'm super new at this, so if this is common knowledge, I'm sorry.
It's not. So collecting pollen is kind of a mess because pollen gets everywhere. But with pine trees, you can actually take a piece of paper, or like I usually just take a piece of paper and kind of fold it, like crease it down the middle, and then I'll show you what I mean, like this. Just take a piece of paper and crease it down the middle so that it's sort of a V shape, and then I'll get the little pine cones and put them inside the little V shape and flick it, and then the dust will collect in the piece of paper, and then you can tip it into a jar or something like that from there. And definitely would say don't do this if you're allergic to tree pollen, and even if you're not, wear a mask and consider wearing eye protection because it's really dusty. And it's very, very fine particles, and they're kind of, sharp little granules that can get into everything and be just irritating even if you're not allergic to them because they're little bits of dust.
Awesome.
Sticky little bits of dust.
How do you use the pollen? I know that you mentioned it can be good as a flower additive, but like
you can put it in capsules. You can or some people like put it in smoothies and things like that too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, for
Do you
next.
ever make it
Go ahead.
with the needle?
Make what?
A tincture with the needle?
A tincture with the needles? Yeah, I do make tincture with the needles sometimes. Usually when I do that, I'm mostly just adding the alcohol to keep it from going bad, and I'm actually making a hot, very concentrated tea with the needles, which would involve chopping them up and then cooking them in water for about 10 minutes and then letting that steep for a while, and then adding enough alcohol to that it won't go bad, so that the finished product is like 20% alcohol or so, and then letting that steep. You could probably do a higher alcohol tincture of the needles too, but I usually don't. I'm not sure if I ever have, but I usually make it in a hot water extract and then add the alcohol to that. But we'll get more into methods for tincture making pretty soon. So a couple of things that I would recommend to everybody, besides looking around your environment and noticing what sort of microhabitats you have and what sort of stands of plants might be growing in those places, I would recommend for anybody to get a field guide to the plants where you live. I really like and often recommend Peterson's Field Guide to Medicinal Plants, which they have a couple of different localized editions for different parts of the United States. They may have them for other places too, but any kind of field guide to flowering plants is good. That one is nice because it focuses on medicinal plants and it talks about what the medicinal properties are, and it was written by two people that I kind of know, both of whom have died in recent years, Stephen Foster and James Duke. They were both all kind of big names in the herbal world. James Duke was a botanist, ethnobotanist with the United States Department of Agriculture, and Stephen Foster did herbal education and took great photographs of medicinal plants, and was involved in the herbal products industry for many years in that kind of capacity. So anyway, that's Peterson's Field Guide, but like I said, any kind of field guide to the plants where you live is a really good thing to have, and you can kind of start familiarizing yourself with different field guides. Use different methods, and everything they use is different from a dichotomous key, which is kind of like a more advanced and more precise but not as easy to use maybe way of learning plants. But a field guide is good. With that particular field guide that I'm thinking of, you can look up plants by color, and then within the colors they have different things about what other features they have besides the color of the flower, and then for each plant it kind of tells you a little bit about its medicinal properties and so forth. So most field guides will work along the same lines generally, as far as flower color, number of petals, things like that, and it can be a good way to learn about some different plants. And later this last weekend in May, later this month, I'll be doing an herb walk that I hope to also have on Zoom, but that anyone who is around here or can come around here is welcome to attend in person. And that will be an outdoor thing, and we'll actually go around and look at some of the plants that are growing, and it's a really good time to be out. late May is a really good time to see a wide variety of different plant life. And so, I hope that some of you can join me for that. And that will be on a Saturday. I believe I have that on a Saturday. Yeah, so that's something to be thinking about as we move forward. Maybe making some time for that if it's possible for you. And next week, same time, this same link should bring you back here again, and we'll be talking some more about getting to know plants and talking about 2 more medicinal plants. And if anybody has any questions for me between now and then, you can email me at themedicinewagon@gmail.com is the email that I've been using to communicate with this group, and you can reach me there. Or I think you probably have my phone number and stuff as well, which is also alright. Alright, any further questions or comments before we go?
Yeah, just one question. When will the recording become available, and how would that be sent out?
I am still working on that. So my plan had been to be able to record the Zoom session to the cloud while I was doing this, and I did not manage to get that to work this time. So I have a different device over here recording me, and I'm gonna probably I might upload that. I suppose I'll probably end up uploading that to YouTube and sending a link to it to people so that they can find it. It'll probably be a video that's only viewable to people that have the link. So hopefully tomorrow, but I'm not completely sure on that because I have not done this before and I'm still figuring it out. So please bear with me.
No worries. I wouldn't know how to do it either. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.